Picture 5 men, young men, good-natured, simple, happy men, the kind who cheer loudly at basketball games and share popcorn and argue about the score on the drive home. Now, picture them gone, not missing in the way that people sometimes go missing, quietly, ambiguously, in ways that could be explained by a bad decision or a worse night. Gone in a way that makes no sense at all. Gone into one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges in California, in the dead of winter, without adequate clothing, without supplies, without any apparent reason to be there. Gone in a way that, more than 45 years later, nobody has ever been able to fully explain. This is the story of Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Ted Weiher, Jack Hewitt, and Gary Mathias. This is the story of the Yuba County Five. Before we get into what happened, you need to understand who these men were, because their identities are not just background detail. They are central to everything, to why the case is so disturbing, and to why so many of the obvious explanations fall apart the moment you look at them carefully. All 5 men were in their mid to late 20s. All 5 had what doctors at the time described as mild to moderate intellectual disabilities. They lived relatively independent lives, some with family, some in shared housing, and they were well-known and well-liked in their community in Yuba County, California. Jack Madruga, age 23, was considered the most capable of the group. He owned a car, a 1969 Mercury Montego, and was the designated driver for the group's social outings. He was responsible, careful, and proud of his independence. Bill Sterling, 29, was quiet and gentle. He lived with his mother and was known for his calm, easygoing nature. He rarely caused trouble and had no history of erratic behavior. Ted Weiher, 32, was the oldest of the 5, larger in build than the others. He was described by everyone who knew him as soft-spoken and sweet-natured. He was particularly close to his mother, who would spend the rest of her life searching for answers. Jack Hewitt, 24, was energetic and sociable. He loved sports, loved being part of a group, and was a familiar face at local basketball games. And then there was Gary Mathias, 25. Gary was slightly different from the others. He had a history of mental illness and prior erratic behavior, including a previous episode that had resulted in a brief psychiatric hold. He had recently been discharged from the Army and was, by most accounts, doing better, more stable, more grounded. The 5 men were friends. They socialized together regularly, often attending games organized through their community program. They were, by every account, a tight-knit, uncomplicated group of young men living ordinary lives. Nothing about them, nothing at all, suggested what was about to happen. On the evening of February 24th, 1978, the 5 men attended a college basketball game in Chico, California. The game was between Cal State Chico and UC Davis, a local rivalry. Nothing unusual. They had been looking forward to it. This was exactly the kind of outing they regularly enjoyed. Chico was roughly 50 miles from their homes in Yuba County. Jack Madruga drove, as he always did. The 5 of them piled into his Mercury Montego and made the trip without incident. They attended the game. They were seen there by multiple witnesses, cheerful, engaged, enjoying themselves. Nothing out of the ordinary. The game ended. And then, at some point during the evening, something shifted. Exactly what? Nobody knows. What is known is that the 5 men never came home. Their families waited. Then they called around. Then they contacted authorities. By the following day, it was clear that the 5 men had not returned from Chico and that nobody knew where they were. A missing persons report was filed, and the search began. The first major discovery came quickly, and it only deepened the mystery. On February 28, 1978, for days after the men disappeared, Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego was found parked on a remote mountain road. Not in Chico, not on the route between Chico and Yuba County, but on Oroville-Quincy Road, a winding, isolated highway cutting through the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, roughly 70 miles northeast of where the men had last been seen. The car was locked. The keys were inside. It was completely out of fuel. The tank was dry, which meant Madruga had driven it there deliberately and kept driving until there was nothing left in the tank. Inside the car, investigators found a small amount of food, items consistent with snacks you might bring to a basketball game. There was nothing to suggest a struggle. No blood. No signs of forced entry or violence of any kind. The car was found near a gateway to the Plumas National Forest, and it was February, in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The temperature at night was well below freezing. None of the 5 men had brought winter clothing. None of them had survival gear. None of them were dressed for the conditions outside that car. They drove 70 miles out of their way into the mountains in winter, and then they got out of the car. Why? That question, simple, direct, and completely unanswerable, sits at the heart of everything that follows. Once the car was found, the search expanded dramatically. Authorities now had a location. They had a starting point. What they needed was to find 5 men in a vast, frozen, mountainous wilderness before the cold killed them, if it hadn't already. Search and rescue teams were deployed into the forest. Helicopters swept the area from above. Ground teams worked through snow-covered trails. Volunteers from the surrounding communities joined in. They found nothing. The search continued for weeks. The terrain was brutal, dense forest, steep ridges, unpredictable weather. Conditions that would challenge experienced hikers with proper equipment. For 5 young men in ordinary clothes, the environment would have been immediately and seriously dangerous. As days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched toward months, hope faded. Officially, the search was scaled back. Unofficially, the families never stopped looking. And then, in June 1978, 4 months after the men disappeared, the wilderness finally gave something back. A ranger conducting a routine check of a Forest Service trailer deep in the Plumas National Forest made a discovery that would define this case forever. Inside the trailer, he found the body of Ted Wire. Ted had been dead for some time. The medical examiner later determined he had survived in the trailer for approximately 8 to 13 weeks after the disappearance, meaning he had lived through the worst of the winter alone in that trailer. He had lost over 100 pounds. His toes had been lost to severe frostbite. He had no shoes on when he was found. The trailer itself contained a supply of food, military-issue rations, enough to last months. There were matches available. There were propane heating units inside the trailer that were fully functional. There were wool blankets on the shelves. He had food. He had heat. He had blankets. And he still died. That detail, the detail that haunts investigators and armchair researchers alike, is that Ted Wire appears to have used almost none of it. The propane units were barely touched. The food was minimally consumed. The blankets were used, but inadequately. It was as if Ted was present in the trailer, but somehow unable or unwilling to fully utilize what was right in front of him. Nobody has ever been able to satisfactorily explain why. In the weeks following this discovery, search teams returned to the area with renewed intensity. They found more. The remains of Jack Hewitt and Bill Sterling were found nearby, in the open, in the wilderness, having clearly succumbed to exposure. They had not made it to the trailer. A shoe belonging to Jack Madruga was recovered in the area. Jack Madruga himself was found not long after, also dead from exposure, his body discovered on a mountain road not far from where the others had been. That left one. Gary Mathias was never found. Not then. Not ever. Gary Mathias deserves his own section, because his role in this story is unlike that of the others, and the questions surrounding him are unlike any of the questions the rest of the case raises. There was, it turned out, a 6th person connected to the events of that night. A man named Joseph Shans had been driving on Oroville-Quincy Road on the same night the 5 men disappeared. His car had broken down, and he had been stranded on the road in the freezing cold, waiting for help. While he was stranded, he reported seeing a group of young men pass by his vehicle. He said they appeared agitated, not calm, not lost, but frightened. He called out to them, asking for help. They did not stop. One of the men, he said, appeared to be directing the others, moving with purpose, keeping the group moving forward into the dark. Investigators later came to believe that the man leading the group was Gary Mathias. If that is true, then Gary was present when the group left the car. He was with them, at least initially, moving deeper into the forest. He was the one keeping them moving. and then he vanished entirely. No body, no remains, no trace in any direction. Unlike the others, Gary Mathias had some experience in outdoor environments from his Army service. Of all 5 men, he was the one most likely to have the physical and mental tools to survive in the wilderness, at least for a time. But he also had a history of severe psychiatric episodes that had previously caused him to behave in ways that were completely out of character, completely disconnected from reality. Had Gary led the others into the mountains deliberately? Had he panicked? Had he experienced a break from reality so severe that he had taken 4 vulnerable men with him into a frozen wilderness? Or had he simply survived and chosen never to come back? Gary Mathias was the one who could have saved them. He was also the one who was never found. To understand how this night might have unfolded, it helps to retrace the steps from the very beginning. Specifically, what happened between the end of the basketball game and the moment the car was found abandoned on that mountain road. The game ended in Chico at around 10 p.m. Multiple witnesses confirmed the 5 men were present and in good spirits throughout. There was no indication of any altercation, no sign of distress, no suggestion that anything was wrong. At some point after the game, investigators believe the group stopped at a convenience store in Chico. The purchase was small, some snacks, the kind of thing you pick up for a long drive home. Normal behavior for a normal night. Then something happened, because instead of taking the direct route home to Yuba County, a straightforward drive south on familiar roads, the car headed northeast, into the foothills, into the dark, away from home, away from warmth, away from everything familiar. Nobody saw them make this turn. Nobody reported seeing the Mercury Montego heading in the wrong direction. Nobody flagged anything unusual. The car simply went the wrong way for 70 miles until it ran out of fuel. Investigators have never been able to establish with certainty what caused this deviation. There were no witnesses. There were no traffic cameras in rural California in 1978. There was no mobile phone data, no GPS, no digital record of any kind. Just 5 men, a car, a tank of petrol, and a road going the wrong way. Over the decades, this case has attracted researchers, journalists, true crime investigators, and ordinary people who simply cannot let go of the questions it raises. And from all of that attention, several distinct theories have emerged. None of them are perfect. All of them explain some things. None of them explain everything. Let's go through them seriously and in full. Theory 1. Gary Mathias had a psychiatric episode. This is the theory that fits the known facts most neatly, at least on the surface. Gary Mathias had a documented history of severe mental illness. He had previously been hospitalized following a psychotic episode. He had, in the past, behaved in ways that were completely irrational and that endangered both himself and those around him. The theory goes like this. At some point during the evening, possibly at the basketball game, possibly at the convenience store, possibly in the car, Gary experienced a psychiatric break. In that state, he may have directed or convinced the others to follow him. Given the group dynamic, with Gary being the most assertive and the others being less likely to resist or question a figure who appeared confident and purposeful, they may have simply gone along with wherever he was leading them. Joseph Sean's account supports this. The figure he described as directing the group, moving them forward with intent, fits the profile of someone in an agitated, possibly delusional state, convinced they were heading somewhere important. This theory also explains why the others didn't simply turn around and go back to the car. If Gary was the de facto leader of the group, and if his behavior was intense and frightening enough, the others may have felt they had no choice but to keep moving. What doesn't explain is why Gary himself was never found. If he led the group into the wilderness in a delusional state, he presumably would have eventually collapsed or died. His remains should be out there somewhere. 45 years of searches have turned up nothing. Theory 2. They were being chased. This theory takes Joseph Sean's description of the group as its starting point, specifically the word he used to describe their demeanor. Frightened. Not lost. Not confused. Frightened. Some investigators have proposed that the 5 men encountered someone or something at or after the basketball game that caused them to flee. Perhaps a confrontation in the car park. Perhaps someone following them on the road. Perhaps an encounter at the convenience store that escalated in ways that terrified the group. Under this theory, Jack Madruga didn't drive 70 miles in the wrong direction because he was lost or confused. He drove 70 miles because he was trying to get away from something or someone. And when the car ran out of fuel, the group had no choice but to continue on foot. The problem with this theory is the absence of any corroborating evidence. No witnesses reported a confrontation. No reports of a threatening vehicle. No accounts of any kind of altercation involving the 5 men on that night. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Rural California in 1978 was not a well-documented place. If something happened on a dark road in the mountains, there may simply have been nobody around to see it. Theory 3. They got lost and panicked. The simplest explanation, and in many ways the hardest to accept, precisely because of its simplicity, is that the 5 men got lost. Perhaps Madruga took a wrong turn in the dark after the game, became disoriented, and kept driving in the hope of finding a recognizable landmark. Perhaps the group grew increasingly anxious as the road became less familiar. Perhaps, by the time the car ran out of fuel, they were too frightened and too confused to make rational decisions about what to do next. This theory is supported by what we know about the group. Men with intellectual disabilities can be more susceptible to panic in unfamiliar situations and less equipped to problem-solve under pressure. The decision to leave the car and walk into the forest rather than stay with the vehicle, which is almost always the safer choice in a survival situation, is consistent with a group in a state of fear making a poor decision. Ted Weiher's behavior in the trailer also fits this framework. A man in a state of severe psychological shock, alone, in a dark and unfamiliar place, might be unable to properly utilize the resources around him, even if they were right in front of his face. The mind, under enough stress, can shut down in ways that look almost like a choice from the outside. But this theory struggles with the same core problem as the others. It explains how they ended up in the mountains. It does not explain Gary Mathias. Theory 4. Something more sinister. And then there are those who believe this was never an accident at all. Some researchers have pointed to the specific detail of the car being completely drained of fuel as suspicious. Not consistent with getting lost, but consistent with someone deliberately driving to a specific location. They point to Gary Mathias's military background and wonder whether he had knowledge of the area, whether he had a reason to go there, and whether the others had any idea what they were being led into. Others have noted the proximity of the area to known drug activity in the late 1970s. Remote mountain roads were frequently used for illicit transactions in that era, and have speculated about whether the group inadvertently stumbled into something dangerous. There are those who focus on the unusual state of Ted Weiher's body, specifically the fact that his shoes were missing, and suggest that this points to foul play of some kind. Why would a man in a trailer, in freezing temperatures, not be wearing shoes? None of this rises to the level of evidence. All of it sits in the uncomfortable space between coincidence and conspiracy, a space that this case has occupied for nearly half a century. Whatever theory you favor, there are details in this case that refuse to sit neatly within any single explanation. Consider the candy bars. When investigators searched the area around the abandoned car and the forest trailer, they found an unusual trail of candy bar wrappers and other small food items, as if someone had been moving through the area and dropping things as they went. It was not a clean, linear trail. It was scattered, inconsistent, almost as if it had been left deliberately, or as if something had caused whoever was carrying the food to drop it suddenly and move quickly. Consider the timeline. The 5 men disappeared on the night of February 24th. The car was found on February 28th, 4 days later. But the car was on a road that search teams would have been expected to check relatively early in the process. Why did it take 4 days to find a car parked on a road? Consider the trailer itself. The Forest Service trailer where Ted Weiher was found was not on any obvious route from the abandoned car. To get there, the group will have had to travel several miles through dense, snow-covered forest, in the dark, in ordinary clothes, in freezing temperatures. The fact that at least some of them made it that far is extraordinary. The fact that they then apparently separated, some reaching the trailer, others dying in the open, raises questions that have never been answered. Why did some of them not make it to the trailer? If the group was moving together, why did they split up? Was there a moment of disagreement? A moment of panic? Did something happen that caused the group to fracture? And there is one more detail. A detail so small it is easy to overlook, and yet one that experienced investigators keep returning to: the screaming. On the night the men disappeared, residents in a small community near Oroville Quincy Road reported hearing screaming in the distance. Multiple people heard it. It lasted for a short time and then stopped. Nobody investigated it at the time. Nobody connected it to the missing men until much later. What caused it? Who was screaming? And what made them stop? People heard screaming in the mountains that night. Nobody ever found out why. It would be incomplete to tell this story without acknowledging the role that investigative failures played in deepening the mystery. The initial response to the disappearance was, by most assessments, inadequate. 4 days passed before the car was found. 4 days during which 5 vulnerable men in thin clothing were exposed to sub-zero mountain temperatures. Whether a faster response could have saved any of them is impossible to know. But the question lingers. When the car was eventually found, the immediate area was not treated as a potential crime scene. Tire tracks, footprints, and other physical evidence that might have told investigators exactly which direction the men had walked were not preserved or properly documented. The search of the surrounding wilderness, while extensive, was hampered by the conditions. The Sierra Nevada in February is not cooperative terrain. Snow covers tracks. Cold destroys evidence. Vast distances make ground searches exhausting and incomplete. And when Ted Weiher's body was eventually found in the trailer, 4 months after the disappearance, the scene had been so affected by the passage of time that many potential clues were irrecoverable. Critics have argued that a more thorough initial investigation, a faster response to the missing persons report, and a more systematic approach to the search could have answered many of the questions that remain open today. Perhaps. But perhaps is not certainty. And certainty is what this case has always lacked. You could spend a long time in this case, reading the reports, studying the maps, tracing the timeline, and find yourself returning again and again to the same point. Gary Mathias. Everything in the Yuba County 5 case radiates outward from Gary Mathias and then curves back toward him. He is the one variable that no theory has ever satisfactorily accounted for. He is the question inside the question. If Gary had a psychiatric episode, his body should be in those mountains. It has never been found. If Gary led the group somewhere deliberately, then he had a reason. What was it? Where did he go afterward? If Gary survived, if he somehow made it out of the wilderness and simply chose not to return, then why? What would cause a man to walk away from his life, his family, and the knowledge that 4 of his friends had died in those mountains? His mother, in the years following the disappearance, consistently refused to believe her son was dead. She maintained that Gary had survived. She could not explain how or why he hadn't come home, but she was certain. No confirmed sighting of Gary Mathias has ever been reported. No body has ever been recovered. No explanation has ever been offered. He is simply gone, more completely, more inexplicably gone than any of the others. For men left bodies. One left nothing, not even a trace. Strip away the theories. Strip away the speculation and the whispered suggestions and the online forums that have spent years picking over every detail. Look only at what is confirmed, what the physical evidence, the witness accounts, and the official record actually establish. Here is what we know for certain. 5 men attended a basketball game on February 24th, 1978. They were seen there, in good health and good spirits, by multiple witnesses. They left the game and drove 70 miles in the wrong direction, into a remote mountain area, until the car ran out of fuel. They left the car, despite the freezing temperatures, and entered the forest on foot. At least one witness saw them moving through the area, apparently frightened, being directed by one of their number. At least one of them, Ted Weiher, survived for several weeks in a forest trailer before dying of exposure and starvation, despite having access to food and heating. 3 others died in the open from exposure. One was never found. That is the skeleton of the case. Bare, factual, undeniable. Everything else, the why, the how, the questions that keep people up at night, remains open. And what makes this case so uniquely, persistently disturbing is not the darkness of it. Though it is dark, it is the ordinariness of where it started. 5 friends going to a basketball game. An evening that should have ended with a drive home and a good night's sleep. Instead, it ended in a frozen forest. In silence. In a mystery that has outlasted almost everyone who was there. The families of the Yuba County 5 spent years, some of them the rest of their lives, looking for answers. Ted Weiher's mother never accepted the explanations offered to her. Gary Mathias's mother never accepted that her son was dead. They were not irrational people. They were not conspiracy theorists. They were mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters who knew these men, who knew their voices and their habits and the specific, particular way they moved through the world, and who could not reconcile what they knew with what had happened. That gap between what we know about a person and what happened to them is where this case lives. It has lived there for over 45 years. The Plumas National Forest still stands. The trail is still there, or what remains of it. The trailer where Ted Weiher spent his last weeks is long gone, but the location is not. People visit it. They stand there in the trees and try to imagine what it was like. The cold, the silence, the darkness, the waiting. Nobody has ever come away with an answer. What happened to the Yuba County 5 is not a mystery in the comfortable, solvable sense of the word. It is not a puzzle with a missing piece that, once found, will make everything click into place. It is something older and harder than that. It is a story about 5 ordinary men who went somewhere they should never have been, for reasons nobody has ever explained, and who paid for it with everything they had. It is a story about the limits of what we can know. And it is a story about one man, Gary Mathias, who walked into the dark and never came back, and who took the only complete answer to all of these questions with him. 5 men, one night, 45 years of silence, and somewhere out in those mountains, maybe an answer that nobody has ever found.